Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this afternoon's Learning Collective session with Judy Katz. Judy, I'm sure many are familiar with, is a top-notch name in the industry and also a risk friend. And today she is going to be presenting, I'm going to get this title correct, Wonder Woman, Wakanda, and Work. How to make your e-learning representative. As many of us know, having e-learning content that is inclusive and representative is often a challenge. And I know you are going to share all of your insights here today to help folks get through that. Sadly, we don't have Trisha Ransom, your partner in crime, with us today. She was not able to be on here due to scheduling reasons, but Judy is the expert in this as well. And I'm looking forward to quite an insightful session with you. And again, welcome to everyone who's tuning in. I'm Ann Wynn, Marketing Specialist with Risk Inc. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to pop it in to the feed below, and we will be sure to answer any questions that you may have or discuss any points that you share with us. And as I mentioned, Judy Katz is here with us today for this session, and I know she doesn't need much introduction, but I'm going to share with you a little bit about Judy. Judy makes stuff that helps people learn. She's an instructional designer and product manager at EduWorks Corporation and has worked in the field of learning and development since 1997. She holds a bachelor's degree in English from the University of Texas, hook 'em, an MBA from Baker University, and a master's in education in instructional design with a focus on workplace learning from UMass Boston. So quite a slew of degrees and whatnot there, right? So
mostly whatnot. Yeah.
very smart is what you are. So let's see. I think we have a couple of comments. Duncan's here. Hey, Duncan. Hi,
Hey,
Kara.
Duncan. Hey, Kara. Hey, I can't. Oh, I can't type in. That's okay. I'll just respond. I like to talk. It's
Oh
fine.
yes, well you can absolutely type in on the side there as well. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring up your session, your presentation, and then have you get started because that's what everybody came here for, right?
Okay. Well,
Take it away.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was a lovely introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And let's go ahead and get started. So basically, this session came about a couple of years ago when Trisha Ransom and I started talking about the difficulty of finding media that really represented ourselves and other people that we wanted to represent in e-learning. And I'm going to use e-learning because a lot of us are in the e-learning field, but of course this extends to all training initiatives, all internal communications, and all external communications as well. So marketing and websites, everything like that. And so it really applies really across the board. But we really felt strongly that e-learning needed to be in there and needed as much attention and care as something that you would produce for external marketing. Because e-learning is one of the ways that a company represents to its employees who that company is, what we believe, and what we want everybody, the values that we want everybody in the company to espouse and to act upon. And it communicates all of those things through how it represents people and the kinds of people that it shows and how it treats people with respect or not, with authenticity or not. And so we put this together originally for DevLearn 2018, and we've kind of hit all of the shows that we could in between then and now. So Kara, thank you so much for saying that. It's been a long, wild ride since then. We had a tremendous amount of fun doing this at DevLearn originally. You'll even get to see some pictures from that today, so it'll be just like you were there. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. And I want to mention, by the way, that in addition to the slides, which you can download, actually, this is the way to download the slides. we have produced an ebook, a personalized ebook for learning, or Pebble book, um, on this topic. And if you want to see it, it's at bit.ly/www eLearning. So that's Wonder Woman Wakanda work, eLearning. And that bit.ly link will take you straight here to the Pebble ebook. And so we have a couple of pictures from that original presentation that were taken by Trisha's most wonderful husband, Jimmy, who's a professional photographer, and lots of other resources here in the ebook. So this is where you can go and download the slides, and you can actually follow along during the presentation as well, with those slides, and look at other resources. We are updating this all the time with lots of resources for stock images, for learning appropriate and respectful language to use, all sorts of stuff here. So if you have anything that you'd like to be added, if you think you have a good resource for this topic, just tweet to us, especially use the hashtag WWWW, and we'll share it with the people who are following that, and potentially put it in the ebook as well. So we love to keep this conversation going on Twitter, on LinkedIn, interpersonally, and there's a place to do that in the ebook as well. So we wanted to put that resource out so that people can have a little bit more than just this hour worth of delving into this topic. And yes, I agree. It is a wonderful topic. Oh, and it is an important topic. And Kara asked the question, do you need to log in? You don't need to log in. You can just click log in, and that'll take you right into the ebook. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. So like I said, we started talking about the sort of terrible representation that we see in a lot of e-learning and a lot of marketing, corporate communications, and how that relates to the media that we were starting to see in real life, in the movie theaters, in comics, etc. And this was right around the time that Black Panther came out, and that Wonder Woman was coming out. So that is why we decided to sort of theme this presentation around them, because in particular, Wonder Woman as a character and Black Panther have been around for decades and decades. And why did we just see major pictures starring them and featuring those characters in the very, very recent past? Well, until very recently, studio executives were constantly making the argument there isn't a market for this. This isn't important. But major motion pictures like this have proven that there absolutely is a market. So Wonder Woman and Black Panther are some of the top grossing action movies of all time. And then after them, Captain Marvel as well. And so lots of movies have really proven that there is an audience to show authentic, diverse characters. And of course there is, because these characters are based on people and groups that are out there in real life that absolutely consume movies, that absolutely consume e-learning, and we like to see ourselves on screen. That is across the board, people identify with, and people are more engaged with characters who look like them, who act like them, who have things in common with them. And you might call it superficial, but that is absolutely a characteristic of human nature. And so it's very important. You know, those films, they were fantastic films for lots and lots of reasons, but they also grossed so much because they provided such excellent, rich opportunities for us to see ourselves on screen. And that was so that is in the past. Those movies like that are continuing, and those lessons can be applied to e-learning, to all corporate communications, to all marketing today. It's worth that extra time. It's worth spending a little bit of extra budget, and less is it the case that you actually even have to do that, because there's more and more media that is out there, that's easily accessible, that is actually representing all of these groups that we're going to talk about today. So it is worth it to make that extra effort, to make your e-learning authentic, to make it representative, to make it diverse. But it's also the case that you have to try less and less hard, because there's lots of better and better stuff out there that you can choose from, and that you can draw from. So we want to always to start this with a little bit of an asterisk, and say that there is a little bit of a pitfall here. We're going to be talking about lots of different groups. When Trisha and I were originally putting this together, it was about women. And it was about the representation of women specifically. And then we started talking about, well, do we want to talk about race and color? Do we want to talk about sexual orientation? And as we continued developing this content, that list just grew, and it grew beyond the groups that we personally represent. So we're going to talk about a lot of different groups of people today, some of which Trisha and I do not are not a part of, or that I alone am certainly not a part of. And there are pitfalls in speaking for groups that you do not belong to. And so I want to just acknowledge that. How we've tried to avoid those pitfalls is by trying to amplify the voices of those groups. And rather than just say what we think, we have tried to bring to the forefront the opinions that are expressed by people in those groups. And we want to continue to do that and keep that conversation open. And we're always open to feedback. If we're not representing something accurately or respectfully or authentically, then we always want to hear that. So that is our asterisk. And again, we just want to acknowledge that. So I want to give a call out to Trisha. Trisha has a fantastic new job, and she was not able to join today because of that, because of the scheduling requirements there. So we miss her very much. We miss her awesome, enthusiastic voice. And hopefully we will be able to do this again on some kind of format that's coming to you, probably online for the foreseeable future. But we hope that we'll be able to do this again. And certainly she is engaged in the conversation on LinkedIn and Twitter, as we continue to have these conversations online. And then this is me. I feel like I have already been thoroughly introduced, so I am going to skip past that now. And thank you again, Anne, for that introduction. So we're going to start with a few whys. Why do we want to create authentic, respectful, diverse representation in our e-learning, and of course, all other forms of media and communication? The first reason is I've already touched on a little bit. When we are kids, we look up to people who look like us. And in fact, that doesn't change pretty much at all as we grow up. When we see people who look like us represented on screen, whether that's a major motion picture or an e learning course, we engage with the content more. We put ourselves in that place. We believe that we can achieve what that person has achieved. And so that is first and foremost, we believe, the top reason to make all of our communications diverse and authentic, because that actually does lift up the people who have not been represented as much in the past. And that actually can have an impact on our culture. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that I've used the word authentic already a lot, and I like that word because to me it expresses that when we represent all groups, we're not doing that as a charity. We're not doing that as a handout. We're doing that because that is how life is. People of color and women are in positions of power all over the world, all over the country, within our companies. And to not represent that as being the case is doing everybody a disservice, not just the people that are in oppressed groups. So this is an example, by the way, from I believe around the midterm elections, Yes, 2018. That was right before we did this for the first time, and it showed how um, in certain offices and departments, this may well be the picture of authority. It's not one that we would typically represent in the past in our e-learning, but that absolutely is what America looks like today, and that is it is authentic to represent that. And by doing this, we're telling the truth. Um, the last reason that we want to give for doing this is that it humanizes us to each other. And I want to use as examples some things that we've seen in current events that are frankly not too pretty. I hope I don't have to talk too much about what these people actually represent, other than saying that we know their faces and their names because they treat others as less than human. And we all also know through research that when we see people who are in oppressed groups, whether it's racial minorities, whether it's women, whether it's people of varying genders and sexual orientations, when we see people who are unlike ourselves represented, those people become human to us, and that changes the culture of our organizations, and it changes the culture that we live in. And we think that right there is one of the most important, because couldn't we all use a little bit more humanity and a little bit more treating each other with respect? So those are the whys. And we're going to get into now the different groups that we wanted to represent. And like I said, there are a lot of groups to talk about. There are a lot of issues to talk about. Each one of these could be a whole one-day workshop at least on, including history and including all of the issues. I actually have about 5 minutes or less to talk about each one of these. So that's a really, really heavy lift. And that's one of the reasons that we want to keep the conversation going. And so we're just going to go through all of these groups, there are about 10 of them, and talk about some of the major issues. And I guess all of that falls to me today, which is unfortunate for y'all. But hopefully Trisha will watch this and pitch in also with anything that I miss. So let's start with color. And talk about the different issues that you want to pay attention to when representing all of the groups that we're going to talk about today. So starting with color, one of the issues that we see most often is that people of color tend to be pictured in very tokenizing ways and in subordinate ways. So by tokenizing, I mean that you have one person of color in a group of white people, and people, it's like you've checked a box. You said, okay, I put a person of color, I put a black person in here, done. And that's your what you call your token black person. Okay, that's tokenization. And a way that you can do that better is to actually represent an entire group that is filled with people of color. Like I said, like we saw the South Fulton, Georgia Justice Department, that very well could be an authentic representation. Also, another thing to pay attention to with color is how are people being represented? Your person of color, are they a secretary? Are they a janitor? Or are they the CEO? You don't have to make every person of color or every person in authority a person of color, but you do want to pay attention to where you're placing people and kind of how they're treated. By the way, one show that I really love, if you want to get used to people of color being placed in all positions, I highly recommend Grey's Anatomy for this, because I think we've seen lots and lots of shows where we have positions like doctors who we might think of as white people, who we might think of as men, and that show does a great job of mixing things up. So if you want to watch something just to kind of immerse yourself in what that feels like, that would be that would be my top recommendation for what to do. So those are some of the big issues. There are others, for example, how are people acting in scenarios? What are their, we touched on this a little bit, what is their placement? If somebody has to, this is the example that Trisha often uses during our presentations. If you have a scenario dealing with, personnel issues at work, and that, somebody has to take off work to go bail somebody out of jail, she would say that's usually a person of color. And just think about what you're saying when you put a person of color in that role. It's never hurts to take a pass at your content, either after you've chosen the media or after you've written it and envision it in your mind, and take a pass for whether you have played into racial stereotypes, because of course that can be very, very damaging, and a big turnoff to the people that you are, the people that are consuming your content. Or if it's not a big turnoff, if it reinforces stereotypes to less oppressed or non-oppressed groups, then that's also a bad thing. I'm going to check the chat really quickly and see if, okay, yes, thank you, Kara. Shonda Rhimes shows are fantastic for that. Okay, so if there's any other questions as we go on, feel free to pop them into the chat, or any other contributions. I appreciate that. All right, so right off the bat, we're dealing with issues of color. Remember, think about how many people of color you see and what kind of positions they are filling, and then what kind of actions they are taking or what kind of situations they're in, because often those can reinforce stereotypes. And what we want to do is break down those stereotypes and help each other see each other as human and as possible candidates to fulfill whatever roles we want to fulfill, and however many we want to fulfill as well. The second issue that we want to talk about is ability. And this one, even within discussions of oppressed people, this tends to kind of get sidelined until the end. So we wanted to move it up to the beginning and give it a little bit more prominence. Um, so people with different abilities or disabilities are not represented very often in media. When they are represented, they tend to be represented by one thing. And if I were giving this presentation to a big group of 200 people, I would be able to say, and what is that thing? And everybody would know because you've seen it. People with disabilities are always, almost always, excuse me, represented by a wheelchair. So there are different ways to do it. Again, you want to pay attention to how often you're representing people with disabilities, and what kind of roles they're fulfilling. You also want to pay attention to how you represent their disabilities. So the wheelchair is a very, very common way to do it. There is a resource in the ebook that I will point your attention to. It's kind of a satirical piece on representing people with disabilities in stock media, and how often they're represented in, first of all, wheelchairs almost across the board, and as like so happy to be in that wheelchair. And again, this is written from the perspective of somebody with a disability and what they think about that. But just to give you a couple of ideas about other ways to represent disability, you can definitely represent people with service dogs. You can represent people with canes. There are, by the way, different canes can have different appearances based on whether they are being used for blindness, or low-sightedness, or simply a cane that's used for motor function disability. So you have a lot of different possibilities there. Another thing that is more subtle, but people who have particular kinds of disorders will notice it and appreciate it, are headphones. If you have autism, if you're autistic, or you have sensory processing disorder, you might use headphones to help you focus, or to drown out complex background noise, or ADHD, by the way. So headphones can be a way to represent differing abilities. So all of those things are valid and things that you might want to include in your representation. Any questions about ability? All right. Then let's also talk about gender. And we're actually going to talk about gender a couple of different times. But first off, we want to talk about representation of women. And again, a lot of the same issues that we talked about with color or race also apply to gender. Um, excuse me. I know everybody out there knows who Gina Davis is. Most people say, yeah, she's an actress, right? She's in a lot of great shows, League of Their Own, Thelma and Louise, et cetera, et cetera. So she is an actress. She's also an activist. And she is the founder of the Gina Davis Institute of Media Studies. And they've done a lot of really interesting work researching how women in particular are portrayed in media. And one of their studies discovered a very, very interesting statistic. And that basically the conclusion of it is that we are not used to seeing women represented in equal number from men. What they did is they showed pictures and just gave people a second to look at a crowd scene, different crowd scenes, and then asked, are there equal numbers of men and women in these crowd scenes? And what they found, really surprisingly, is that men and women rated a crowd scene as equal, being equally distributed between men and women, if women only made up 1/6 of the crowd scene, or about 17%. So it's no wonder that when women actually comprise half of a crowd scene, or take up half of the space on a screen, or speak half of the time within a movie or within e-learning, that we really think of that as very female dominant, because we're not actually used to women taking up that much space. So one of the really big issues in representing women is simply representing an equal or greater than equal number of women when we represent them. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg says, she's fine with there being 9 women who are Supreme Court justices, because in the past we've had all men and nobody questioned that. So it is perfectly okay to have a scene in your e-learning that is all women, and to represent that in your text, in video, in audio, in images, however you're representing that. Again, another issue there is how women are being represented. Are they the secretaries? Are they the nurses? Are they the teachers? And sometimes this is just as much a matter of representing men in women's roles, quote unquote women's roles, as it is representing women in men's roles. So you do, and again, huge air quotes here, because we know that, most jobs, almost all jobs, are not really gender specific. So go ahead and have that female CEO, but also go ahead and have that male nurse, male secretary, male teacher, especially nurses. This is something that is very much in demand. So that's it's a matter of breaking down gender stereotypes in several ways, not just showing women in CEO roles, but also normalizing men in roles that have been more traditionally focused on women. All right, hop in with questions anytime, and we will go on. Next, we're going to talk about sexual orientation. And this is a really tricky widget. Like, so far, we've talked about things that are very easy to represent in media. So, for example, if we're picking stock images, it's easy to go and say, okay, well, I want to represent people of color, I want to represent women, I want to represent people of all abilities in my stock images. But what does that mean when you get to something like sexual orientation? Can you tell whether someone is gay by looking at them or by listening to them? You can't. Can't have any audience feedback today, but I'll just skip to the spoilers. You can't. And so you can think that you know that because of stereotypes that have been reinforced in our culture, but actually you cannot. So, what does it mean to represent somebody or represent different sexual orientations in our media? Well, that could be, first of all, if you see something that you feel like is stereotypically gay, you can include it. If you feel like somebody is being represented as gay, you absolutely can include that. So there is that component. But also, when you talk about someone's personal life, which there is the opportunity to do in some e-learning topics, you can talk about somebody's partner or their wife or husband and represent a gay relationship. Totally fine to do. There is room for representation without being stereotypical and without relying on what we think a gay person looks or sounds like. This really should only come into play when we're talking about people's personal relationships. And so it's not as big of an issue. It's not as visual media driven of an issue as some of the other things, but something that we absolutely want to include to to be inclusive and representative for all groups. National origin is something that we also want to talk about apart from color or race, particularly in Silicon Valley. Trisha loves to talk about this because she works in Silicon Valley. Right now, she works for Uber. Of course, not just Silicon Valley, but this is one that she's had a lot of experience with because of that. Representing different national origins. Not everybody in our workplace is from the same place. And people from different countries may have different customs, different food preferences, obviously different languages. We can represent different national origins by including people with accents, including people with names that are not stereotypical white American names. We by including in any discussion of personal life or in food or in culture or in uh, visual representations as far as what people look like and people wear. We can represent lots of different national origins. And it may well be important to do so, particularly for the organizations that we work in. If your organization includes a lot of people who are working there on visa or who have immigrated, then typically they are not seeing themselves in a lot of e-learning. And it's very impactful, it's very meaningful for them to see themselves. Now, this is a huge topic. Again, each of these could probably be a one day workshop. And I know that a lot of people may be saying, well, how do I make sure that I am including everybody when I may not know how to? And we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about pitfalls toward the end. But this is something where you may well want to include people in your organization as part of your decision making process, as part of your review process. And there are bad and better ways to do that. So we'll follow up on that topic as well. Now, I said we were going to talk about gender a couple of times. And this is, so we've already talked about the representation of women. We also want to talk about the representation of transgender and binary or non-binary individuals. Not binary. We see binary individuals all the time. But this is worth coming back around to this topic to talk about all genders. Actually, a few years ago, we linked to this article in the ebook as well. A few years ago, Julie Dirksen did a series of articles in Learning Solutions addressing issues of gender. And I was thrilled to be asked to write one of those. And it was specifically about representation of women and, or, yes, representation of women and issues of like how were women represented, how often, et cetera, et cetera. And that was kind of one of the bases for all of this. this presentation, but it was also the first time that the word transgender was used in Learning Solutions magazine. And so I was kind of thrilled with that and being able to bring this topic out because it's a huge topic. And I think that it's one that is getting a whole lot of national attention. And there are a lot of people who kind of mean well, but don't know what to do about it. So there are lots of issues here. So first of all, we've talked a lot about the visuals. We've talked a lot about, where to find good stock photos or how to judge good stock photos. And back then, this was 5 years ago, back then on the issue of finding stock photos that represented transgender people, my advice was honestly just to beg people don't search iStock photo for the word transgender. It's absolutely horrible. The representation could not be worse. And there was not a lot of good places to point people 5 years ago. Now I'm happy to say there's a whole lot of improvement. In the ebook, we link to some places that you can find fantastic collections of very respectfully represented, authentic representations of transgender people. And so that's fantastic. I still think that there is work left to go. Even in very common sites like iStock Photo, the representation is a lot better than it has been. I think that actually some of the photos that I found 5 years ago, I'm pretty sure that they've been removed altogether because you probably can imagine some of the stereotypes that they played into. They were just terrible. And I think they've been removed altogether, which I think is great. So what's out there today is it's more respectful, it's better, but I still kind of have a beef on this topic because it tends to focus on people's personal lives and images of transgender people at pride parades, frankly. There aren't a whole lot of great collections that focus on people at work. So I feel like there's still work left to be done here, but there's a whole lot better. The situation is a whole lot better now than it was 5 years ago. So that's really good. Another thing that you can search for if you're doing media image searches or image searches is androgynous. So that can be a good way to represent somebody who somebody might think of as transgender or who might question what gender this person is as a way to break down those barriers. Because it's not just about specifically putting in pictures of transgender people. It's about breaking down the barriers for how people think about gender and maybe leading people to question assumptions about how they think about gender. Again, same question or with as we asked with sexual orientation, can you tell someone is transgender by looking at them? And again, the answer is no. Most often in groups, people will say yes, even more than with sexual orientation. And I'm here to tell you that the answer is no. Not all transgender people transition physically. So somebody may be transgender without, and they may look very much how most people would say, oh, this is a woman, this is a man, I have no question about this. But transitioning is not something that all transgender people do. Somebody might be non-binary, and simply perhaps the physical presentation isn't that important to them. And that's okay. Transgender people don't owe you a, uh, a gender presentation that makes you comfortable. And they don't owe you passing for a particular gender. Anyone can have any kind of presentation that they want with respect to gender. So when it comes to representing transgender people in media, you need to keep that in mind, that it's not always about showing somebody who looks physically transgender. That is absolutely something that we should show, but that's not everything with regard to representing transgender individuals. I think that there was a comment here in the chat that I saw pop up. Yes, are resource links available in the Pebble book? Yes, they absolutely are. Like I said, there are some fantastic libraries out there. There are even some free fantastic libraries out there that people have put together. And those links are in the Pebble book, so it's fantastic. Another thing that you'll find in the Pebble book is a fantastic link that is the best link I've found, the best guide that I've found to using language, because this is another one of the big issues with representing transgender people authentically and respectfully, is that I'm pretty sure everybody has heard that people can choose their own pronouns, or people can have pronouns that maybe don't match what you think their gender presentation looks like. And so the question of pronouns is discussed in the GLAAD Media Reference Guide that's there, that's linked up in the Pebble book. And also other issues. There are lots of words that have been commonly used in the past that are not acceptable to most transgender individuals now. This is something where this is a topic where what's acceptable to do is changing more rapidly than some of the others, because this topic was hidden from view for so long and is now much more in the public eye and more present. That's why we're talking about it a lot. And so things can be changing pretty rapidly, and it's understandable if you feel like you can't keep up. However, making that effort is super, super important, and not actually that hard once you get into it. And I highly recommend looking at the GLAAD Media Reference Guide and some of the links there for stock images. Let's see. I don't think there's anything else. No other questions. Okay, we're going to go on and talk about age. This is a similar message here as some of the other issues. Represent people of all ages. Pay attention to how you treat them. Pay attention to what roles they're fulfilling. Pay attention to what parts they're playing. This is kind of a tough one, because we talk a lot about generations in the workplace, and a lot of the language that we use when we talk about that really borders on ageism, or is outright ageism, especially when we talk about millennials and all of the stereotypical things about millennials, or for that matter, about baby boomers and silent generation above them. Um, there are a whole lot of stereotypes, like older people can't use computers or younger people are irresponsible. It is ageism. It is not a good thing to do. In a lot of places, it's against the rules or outright illegal. So you really want to pay attention to that language, as well as how people are being represented in media, and make sure that the things that you say don't reinforce those stereotypes and play into those stereotypes about age, because that's very, very damaging. Um, Also, on the same vein, body type and size. This can be a really, really tricky one when we're talking about using stock images, because I think that even as stock images have gotten better with regard to gender stereotypes and race, they still tend to be pretty universally skinny when it comes to body type and size. So that can be a very difficult thing to find, excuse me, to work around if you are using stock images, and if you're using in particular the very standard stock image sites that are going to give you the less expensive stock images, which I know that we all do, because eLearning usually doesn't have a big budget. We usually have to use lots and lots of images, so it can be very challenging to find images that really fit within your budget. And so going to, Getty signature images or whatever is sometimes not an option. We're going to talk about some ways to work around that, but including people of various body types and sizes, and again, paying attention to how they're treated. Um, you know, making sure that, you know, it's okay to have a woman who is plus size, have her in a position of power. This is an okay thing to do. And again, there are good resource links for that in the Pebble book. But another thing that I want to point out here is that, and this applies to all of the almost all of the issues that we've talked about. Another thing that we want to apply here is that you can make your own media, and you can do that a couple of different ways. You might have, for example, a photo shoot so that you can hire your own models. And just create your own media. And it's easier to do than it sounds. Or particularly with body type, you might use illustrations instead, because you can alter illustrations a lot more easily than you can alter images. And even if you're using some stock illustrations, like if you're using Storyline, and you have, you know, those illustrated characters, I have pushed those to the limit. I'm a big stickler for aspect ratio and keeping things the same aspect ratio. However, so that things don't look stretched out. However, I have discovered that a lot of those stock images can be stretched out about a third to 40% without looking completely altered in the face. And it actually gives them a little bit more of a realistic body. So using illustrations is one way to go to give people more realistic bodies. And then, of course, you can search out the image libraries as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to do those things. I think I'm running out of time. Talking about these issues, there are a couple of other things that I wanted to squeeze in here, right, Kara? I will say I'm a stickler, so I'm not going to go so far as to say that you should destroy your aspect ratio, but push it and see how far you can widen that image so that the face still looks okay. And maybe you can give that body a little bit more than a wasp waist, right? Okay, so I'm going to call out some people now and talk about some examples that I've seen out in the wild. And one of these is from Twitter. And I took the person's name off so that I'm not calling out a bad example. But this is this is from a GIF that somebody in our industry made and is sharing on Twitter. They actually share lots of GIFs with, you know, cartoons and things like that, and they're very cute and they're very instructive. But literally 20 minutes, I always have to add something like 20 minutes before we give this presentation or any presentation, because, you know, it's just not fun if you're not on a high wire. All right, now please don't call out the person. And to be fair, I have addressed this with them specifically. I'm not just, you know, doing this behind their back. So I have messaged them and told them exactly what I'm about to say. Yeah, I found this like 20 minutes before we did this presentation once, and just quickly screen capped most of the images in a particular GIF. Because if you look at these images, this is all white people. Most people in positions of authority are men. The construction workers are men. There are no people of color whatsoever. Occasionally somebody will raise their hand and say, oh, okay, well, the silhouettes, you just don't know. Okay, you don't know with the silhouettes, but based on everything else that's here, they probably are supposed to be white people. And if this is an attempt to represent possibly people of color, that's not how you do it. That's not an okay method to go with. And also the women, we actually counted this in a presentation one time, and found that the number of women or people who we perceive as women was almost exactly 1/6. So this person probably thinks that they have, that they have accurately done an equal representation or showed an equal representation of women. I'm going to plug in so that doesn't happen again. We don't get shut down. All right. They probably think that they are showing an equal representation of women because they have about 1/6 women in their cartoons. And so like I said, I did address this with the person who published them, and I said, there are reasons that you might want to do better, and you can do better. And they said, no, it's really hard to do that. And I'm like, okay, well, you know, um, what can I say? I I think that there are lots of reasons that this is worth the effort, but that's not always something that I can convince people of. So on the other hand, if this is the wall of shame, then this is the wall of fame. This is Connie Malamed, and I will call out in person the people who are doing a fantastic job. This is at the Canadian eLearning Conference in 2019. Right, Kara? If it were easy, then everybody would be doing it, and we wouldn't have to convince people for the most part. So that's really fantastic thing to point out. Okay, so on the Wall of Fame, this is Connie Malamed at the eLearning conference. She's keynoting the Canadian eLearning Conference 2019. And she was talking about, God, I can't remember. It's like user personas. I was too busy like snapping pictures of her slides because they were fantastic. I absolutely couldn't find much to fault at all as far as her representation in her slides. Again, just going by visuals. I don't know how many of these people are transgender, but I do know that I'm seeing a variety of gender presentations, and I do know that I'm seeing a variety of colors, and very possibly different national origins. So not a ton dealing with different abilities, but overall, I thought that she did an excellent job of creating a very diverse, very representative group of people throughout her presentation. So I snapped some pictures of various slides that she had put up. And I came up to her afterward, of course, asked to use her as an example, and said, I just really appreciated how much, what a great job you did at representing so many different kinds of people. And she just said, thanks. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And I thought that that was just as good of a counterpoint to our previous example as I could possibly come up with. So she is definitely on the Wall of Fame. Oh, Kara, that's a great comment. I feel like people don't have excuses anymore with the 10,000 AI generated faces. That's a fantastic thing to bring up. And actually, I'm going to put that in the ebook. And one of the resources that's already there is actually a name generator. So you can specifically generate lists of names, have them specific to different genders, different places in the world. So really, as far as faces and names and everything like that, honestly, these might have been from that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But there are lots of different ways to come up with things that are ways to sort of bring you out of your own comfort zone if you need a little bit of help doing that, and to generate the media and the people that we want to represent. All right, so let's talk a little bit about pitfalls. And this is normally where we try to get a lot of audience interaction. And we haven't, we're not able to do that as much today, but since we're not in the same room. But if anybody has any questions about pitfalls that they have tried to avoid and maybe haven't found a way, then you are welcome to put that in the chat. We can play a little bit of Stump the Chump. And I can try to help you come up with some new ideas. Other than that, though, until I see any questions, I'm going to revisit and then bring up some new ideas for how to thank you, Kara. I know you will interact. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in. But I'm also going to try to throw out a couple of other ideas. I'm definitely running a little bit behind where I would like to be as far as the time, but I want to revisit the ideas of doing your own Oh, this is a really great question from Risk. Okay, so doing your own photo shoots using illustrations instead of stock photos. It's a great thing to do. And there's a good example of that in the ebook as well. And then Risk asked about what about those with disabilities that aren't visible? So uh, disabilities that aren't or disabilities that aren't visible, you can't necessarily represent them through media, so you don't have that kind of challenge. It's kind of the same thing as with sexual orientation. You use the opportunities that you have based on the content that that you have. So you might talk about somebody taking a mental health day, and try to normalize that, because that's very much not only representing somebody who might have PTSD or might have a mental illness that might cause them to take a day. Of course, it's not only representation, but it's kind of promoting the idea that that's an okay thing to do. Because honestly, like, who couldn't use a mental health day regardless of whether you have a mental illness or not? But when you normalize that, though, you make that okay. You create that space for the people who have disabilities. Or if you simply talk about it, and talk about it in um, respectful ways based on how a group of people want to be represented. So, for example, when you talk about autistic people, you use the phrase autistic people instead of person with autism. Many people with disabilities like that person first language. Autistic people don't. It's too many words, too many words for us. So we like to say autistic people. And knowing the preferences of the groups and of course, this is not to a person. Each individual has their own preferences, but overall, this is what the autistic community has said. And paying attention to those people and how they like to be represented will give you those opportunities, and make sure that you can represent them respectfully. So lots of thank you very much. And by the way, I wanted to come back to the idea of actually involving the people that you want to represent. So there are good ways to do that, and then there are less good ways to do that. And I promise to revisit that a little bit. And here it comes. What you don't want to do is walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, um, you're Black. Will you make sure that this looks authentic or that this sounds authentic for my e-learning course?" That would be a tokenizing way to approach someone, and we don't want to do that. And if anybody puts a video of me on the internet doing that, I will be very upset, because that is definitely a non-example. You do not want to tokenize them or anyone by involving people in your efforts. What you do want to do is not assume that just because somebody is a member of an oppressed group, that this is an interest for them or that they're an expert, and try to make them speak for their people. Not a good way to approach things. What you do want to do is search out whether your organization has networks of people who support each other. Generally, when I have worked within large organizations, there have been women's networks, people of color networks, LGBTQ plus networks. You can approach those networks and ask them for volunteers, not necessarily volunteers that wouldn't be compensated, but for people who would like to be involved as advisors for your e-learning team, and can help you create something that is more authentic, and that is more representative. And they can participate in the content creation as well as reviewing what you've created to make sure that it sort of fits the bill for that group. And also make sure they're compensated for their time. This is of course, if you're asking somebody at work to do work, you want to make sure that that is something that is okay with their boss, and that it can be included in their workload, and show them some appreciation as well. However, that works within your company, whether that's stars in your collaboration system, or a Starbucks gift card, or whatever, so that they can be compensated for their emotional labor in addition to the time that they put into it. Um, Closing thought that I want to leave everybody with. As you are just starting to um, do diversity work, you may well make missteps. It may well be very uncomfortable. You may have people come to you and say, you did that wrong. You hurt my feelings. You offended people. And when that happens, and it will happen, I want to leave everybody with the thought that you want to be open to that criticism. You want to remember that we're doing this to include people, to represent people, to make people feel good. And therefore, we have to listen to the opinions of the people that we're representing. They're never wrong. Just because our own feelings are hurt. And just because we intended to do something good, that doesn't mean that the impact was good. That doesn't mean that we successfully got to that finish line. So we have to remember that intention is less than impact. And to know what impact our work has, we have to listen to the people who are impacted by it and take their opinions seriously and their feedback. Okay, so there's a question in here. By the way, do we have a hard stop right at noon, or are we going to continue with questions? Because it looks like we have a couple to
we
handle.
have a few minutes for questions, so
Okay,
definitely, yeah.
Thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna go ahead and put the other, put that all important information up there. So you can access the ebook. You can contact me and Trisha by email and by the Twitter. And you can follow the hashtag because we often put out resources and there's some discussion there. So let's go ahead and take any remaining questions that we have. What about power dynamics, Judy? Oh, this is a fantastic question. Any tips on how to show that beyond roles like male mechanics? Oh, I do. I have a great example about that. And I think that we tweeted it under that hashtag before, but I will try to find it and tweet it again. If not, actually add it to the ebook because it's such a fantastic example. There was a like a I don't know what you call it. It's basically a billboard, but something that you would put on like construction scaffolding as people are walking down the street. There was a big color ad for a university recently, like big full bleed color. Most of it was an image for for their university, and it was supposed to show students, and it did show mostly women. And there were, as far as I remember, maybe not. There were women of color included, but probably more than one. And then there was one man in the picture as well. And um, it was so just based on the numbers, that's pretty good so far. But how they were positioned was terrible. The man was talking, like everybody was seated at a table or kind of gathered around each other. The man was talking, and everyone else was listening. And it was very, very apparent from the photo of what was going on, and it showed a very specific power dynamic. So there was no indication of what people's job roles were, or hypothetically they were all students, so there was no differential there, but there was so much communicated by just how they looked at each other, and who was talking, who was playing which role. There was so much about power dynamics that was communicated by that, and that is a very, very important thing to pay attention to. So it's not just a matter of who's playing the CEO, how many women do you have, and everything like that. It's very much also a question of what power dynamics are implied by how you write about them and how you represent them visually, and all of those same issues apply. Look at what you're reinforcing by what you present. And if it's something that reinforces existing stereotypical roles, then you might want to check that, because that's going to be a problem for all of the reasons that we talked about at the beginning. We want to actually humanize each other. We want to give people in oppressed groups something to look up to and to see themselves, and to communicate to everybody within our organizations that no matter who you are, that we see you. We see this potential for you to be in this role, and for everybody to succeed. Anything else? Or that was a
That was amazing.
Good place to leave
Yes.
if we don't have any more questions.
I don't see any further comments or questions, but of course, if you're watching the video, the replay of the video, feel free to drop in comments and questions and your thoughts and any other contributions. As Judy had mentioned earlier, we'd love to hear from you, and then we'll make sure that Judy gets any other questions. And we will be sure to include how to contact Judy and Trisha as well in the comments below. But I absolutely loved this session and the presentation. So thank you very much for your time today and sharing this with us again. And hopefully, we'll be able to continue to have this conversation and dive in deeper. I know you shared a lot of information, but it was really very valuable and absolutely necessary. And as a marketer, I think there are a lot of things that are applicable for our marketing content as well.
I hope so.
So I think it's just applicable across any vertical, as you mentioned. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Thanks, Kara, for all of your insights and comments as well. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Learning Collective session. As a reminder, this video remains on our Facebook page and will also be available on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. So you'll be able to access it at any time on your favorite social media channel.
And when it is, I will put it in the Pebble book as well, because this is the only time this session has been recorded. So I will put that in there and people can continue to the discussion and see it again.
Absolutely, because it is a conversation that is going to constantly be evolving, I believe, and we need to continue to have. So thank you so much, Judy. And thank you to Trisha as well, who was unable to be here with us. So
all right.
We'll see you all soon. Thanks again
for having me.